Okay, so we're going to turn our attention now to where the trouble really starts, and that's in Texas. Is anyone here from Texas, by the way? You probably would have made us aware of the fact by now. Okay. Now, in the 1820s, a couple of guys from Connecticut, father and son, named Moses Austin and his son Stephen Austin, decided to leave New England. And actually, they hoped they were leaving behind this money-grubbing, contentious American society. And, as I said, form a little world of our own, where neither religious, political, nor money-making fanaticism shall ever obtain admission. And they call this Texas. Okay. And in the 1820s, the Mexican government was encouraging people to move to Texas. This is the northernmost part of Mexico, the north of Coahuila province. And it was fairly barren territory, home of the Comanche Indians, hot summers, fairly dry climate except in the east, and so on. And the Mexican government wanted to establish a population here to protect it from incursions by others and also to settle it. It'll be a good thing. And so in 1825, the government of Mexico gave a grant to the Austins for a tract of land between the Sabine River, which, as you probably know, is now the western border of the state of Louisiana, and the Nueces River, which, if you follow Texas down, it's about halfway down the coast of Texas, I think. And by the middle of the 1820s, there were about 1,800 people in the Austins colony, and about 400 of them were slaves. Now, this is an issue because in 1824, Mexico had abolished slavery, but as a way of encouraging these Americans to move in, it granted to this part of Mexico, that is Coahuila province, people could have a lifetime indenture. So it's a way of allowing slavery while not allowing slavery. And by 1830, that is just after about 5 years, there were 20,000 people in the Austins colony, and about 1,000 of them were slaves. Okay, so this is the backstory here. You have this territory, northern part of Mexico, which is part of Mexico, and then in 1835, the Texans declared independence from Mexico. And the United States remained neutral in this as Texas fought it out. You might know the whole story of this whole exciting episode. March 6, 1836. What happened on March 6, 1836? The Alamo, right. You remember the Alamo. Right? Should we sing the song about, 181 men challenged by Travis to die? It's okay. He tries the sign line in the sand and so on. And then, Alamo is taken on, and then April 21st, 1836, Santa Anna's army is defeated. So this kind of sets the tone for this. The Texans cannot prevent the Mexican government from sending an army to try to subdue them. The Mexicans can never get the Texans to surrender. So this is a standoff in here. I believe this is where the phrase Mexican standoff comes in, and I apologize if that's a pejorative term. Have you ever heard that, Roberto? Mexican standoff? Okay, I know you're not Mexican, but I was just asking if anyone has heard that. It's just something that my mother-in-law used to say, and she says all kinds of wacky things. You've heard the term. Thank you. So you have these two forces, and then what happens is this. France and England want to mediate this and to establish Texas's independence, thinking this will be useful both as a bulwark against Mexico, but also a bulwark against the United States, an independent Texas. There are some in Texas who want Texas to be annexed to the United States. In fact, I suspect most Texans wanted annexation to the United States. Also a lot of Americans favor annexation of Texas. Calhoun favored annexation of Texas. Lots of Southerners favored annexation of Texas. lots of New Englanders opposed annexation of Texas. John Quincy Adams said, "The annexation of Texas to the Union is the first step to the conquest of Mexico, the conquest of the West India Islands, of a maritime, colonizing, slave-tainted monarchy, and of extinguished freedom." So if you catch his drift, John Quincy Adams did not support the annexation of Texas for a variety of reasons. There's another story about Congressman extolling the benefits of bringing Texas into the Union, a senator, and the senator saying that Texas can become a flowering paradise. All she needs are water and lots of good people. And Daniel Webster said, "If I am not mistaken, that is all hell needs to become a flowering paradise." So this Texas becomes a contentious issue in the 1830s, the annexation of Texas and what it will mean. And, look, it's a huge chunk of territory. Texas could become 5 states. Slavery is already firmly established. In fact, there are more slaves in Texas at this time than there are in Kentucky or Tennessee. So you're going to have 5 new slave states, new cotton lands opened up. And so the legislatures in Vermont, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Ohio vote against annexing Texas. Texas now is asked for annexation. But the legislatures of Maine, New Hampshire, Illinois, Michigan, Alabama, Missouri, Louisiana say we should annex Texas. And actually the split really is not north and south, so much it's Democrats who want the annexation of Texas for it, and the Whigs against it. The Whigs see this as a spreading of slavery, more population going that way, and very much against it. And John Tyler, who becomes, Jackson, this happens in the Van Buren administration. Van Buren opposes the annexation of Texas, and it could be one reason he loses the election in 1840. President Harrison, we don't really know what Harrison thought about Texas. He only is president for a month. And John Tyler becomes president in 1841. He's called His Excellency because no one expected. He's the first vice president to become president on the death of the president. And there's also ambiguity. Should he have all the powers of the president? What do you think? Should he? But he wasn't really elected president. They put him on the ticket because he used to be a Democrat. He had been a Democrat till he fell out of favor with Jackson, suddenly becomes a Whig. The Whigs think, hey, we need a Southern Democrat on the ticket. Who better than John Tyler? And so now he's president. The Whigs have a fit about it. The Whigs really outsmarted themselves in 1840. They put this guy on the ticket hoping to get votes, and they did, and then the guy they wanted dies. So he should have all the powers of the president, even though he wasn't elected. He was elected vice president. I could see if the Constitution hadn't been changed, so you vote for a president and a vice president. But you can see why this is a constitutional issue. What powers should the president have? But it's also a political issue. It has a lot to do with whether or not you like Tyler. And Tyler wants to annex Texas, even more so after Calhoun becomes the Secretary of State. And Calhoun wants to annex Texas. Actually, Calhoun becomes Secretary of State in an interesting way. This may be another reason Tyler was called His Excellency. He and his cabinet went down to the Potomac to see a new warship the Navy had just built, the Princeton. And the Princeton had this huge gun called the Peacemaker. Great name for a gun. And the gun blew up. And in blowing up, it killed the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of War, along with other visitors to the ship. Tyler had just left, and then everyone else blows up, and then Tyler has to find a new cabinet, and one of them is John C. Calhoun. Actually, and this is 1844. It's also, of course, this is February. Daniel Webster also serves in Tyler's cabinet, and he invites Tyler to come to the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument in June of 1844. And John Quincy Adams won't go to the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument because Tyler will be there. And as he puts it, Daniel Webster will be bloviating. And what has this to do with the Battle of Bunker Hill? Adams remembered the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he's outraged that Tyler and his passel of slave-holding cronies will be atop Breed's Hill. And he said, if you've seen a portrait of Tyler, he had a very large nose, and in his diary, John Quincy Adams wrote, "The shadow of the president's nose obscures the monument being raised on Breed's Hill." Chalk up another one. Adams doesn't want the annexation of Texas, doesn't like John Tyler, really doesn't like Daniel Webster. If you go to the Adams house in Quincy, you'll see that Adams wound up with Webster's bed. I don't know how, but anyway. So you have this issue here. England is trying to get Texas. Okay, so Calhoun realizes that will be bad if England gets an independent Texas or uses Texas as a foothold. So Calhoun begins trying to negotiate a treaty to annex Texas. Texas being a sovereign nation, I guess, could make a treaty, although Mexico hasn't recognized Texas's independence, so Mexico will object. But if England supports this, then Mexico will have less grounds. Congress won't ratify this. Congress wants nothing to do, you can't get a two-thirds vote in the Senate to agree to a treaty to annex Texas. And what happens after the election of 1844, when it is clear, Tyler isn't even a candidate for re-election. The Congress that had been elected in 1842 has just been turned out of office, and this Congress passes a joint resolution by which the United States annexes Texas to the United States. And President Calhoun signs this act of Congress, and in Texas, a convention accepts annexation. So, legally, can the United States do this? Can Congress, by a joint resolution of both houses, annex a chunk of territory like Texas? And can that people in that territory then agree to this annexation? You're looking. You'd say yes. Well, it's not a two-thirds. It's a majority in both houses. Oh, that's different? It's just a majority. It's not two-thirds? Well, it's not. They're not amending the Constitution. They're simply agreeing to get Texas, not to purchase it, but just to annex Texas, because they're not buying it from anyone. Mexico owns it, but Mexico is not selling it. The people in Texas say, "Hey, we want to be independent of Mexico," and Congress says, "Great, you now can become part of the United States."
I guess they would look at what Jefferson did.
What did he do?
Jefferson purchased and made Louisiana.
Yeah, but there's no question that France owned Louisiana, and the United States made a treaty with France by which France sold Louisiana to the United States. Now, in this case, Mexico claims Texas. Texas claims it's independent, and the United States doesn't make a treaty with anyone, just says, we'll annex Texas if Texas agrees, and so the rest is history.
The people of Texas are able to protect themselves against,
Well, yes and no. I mean, they haven't really been able to prevent the Mexican army from coming into Texas, although they've been able to drive it out, but it could come back. Had poor Santa Anna not been captured after the Battle of San Jacinto, who knows? Yes, Mike.
So was it just a joint resolution of Congress, but did the president sign it?
Yeah, the president signs it, and so Congress says, let's annex Texas. Tyler says, okay. It's actually on his last day in office, and so then in July, the people of Texas say, we'll be annexed. Yes, Tim?
Isn't it akin to Congress declaring war against Mexico by annexing the territory?
It could very well be taken by Mexico as a declaration of war, and this is what happens next. In February of 1846, actually, the new president doesn't have any qualms about Texas. Actually, in 1844, the two leading candidates for president were Henry Clay, the Whig, Martin Van Buren, the Democrat, and they both came out against annexing Texas. And the Democrats then rejected Van Buren and instead nominated the Speaker of the House, James K. Polk, to be president. You're a Polk man, 54-40 or fight. There's not, a slogan that has nothing to do with Texas. 54-40 is the northern boundary of British Columbia. And this is the territory the United States called Oregon. And said 54-40, the northernmost boundary of British Columbia, Britain will acknowledge that or fight, right? We're going to go to war with England over British Columbia. And here we know England is scheming with Texas. That's kind of a sideshow, 54-40 or fight. It's one of those great slogans of all time, I think. What happens is Polk is elected. So, the new president is certainly committed to keeping Texas, even though it hadn't been a big issue for him. And what happens then is the army is sent down to Texas to protect it. And as I said, the Mexican government had recognized the Nueces River as the border of Texas. Now the United States claims actually the border is the Rio Grande. And President Taylor orders the American army to go south of the Nueces into this disputed territory, and once they're there, what do you know? The Mexican army shoots at them because they say you're actually now in Coahuila province and not in Texas. And President Polk then takes this as a reason to declare war on Mexico because Mexico, after all, has attacked American soldiers on American soil, and that's something nobody does. And this, the war with Mexico, well, I don't know if any of you have strong feelings about it. Anyone have strong feelings about the Mexican War? It's a curious war. Well, not really a curious war. It actually is, if possible, less popular in New England than the War of 1812 had been. And as I said, John Quincy Adams was very much against the annexation of Texas, and he wants, when the Whigs take control of the House of Representatives, which they do midway through the war, and the Whigs had been against the war, John Quincy Adams proposes that Congress simply cut off all military appropriations to stop the war. It certainly would have done it. And he says there's no reason to have this war because this is part of this whole scheme to annex all of Mexico and so on. And Albert Gallatin, who had been Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, writes a pamphlet denouncing the war. And then there's a public meeting at New York where he is supposed to speak. A pro-war mob attacks the meeting, breaks it up, forces Gallatin off. So you have this, really, feelings run very high about the war, ran very high. I'm not getting a sense that you folks are really agitated about the war in Mexico tonight. There's also the kind of classic protest here in New England. Henry David Thoreau refuses to pay his taxes and winds up in jail and writes a pamphlet called Civil Disobedience. Anyway, Ralph Waldo Emerson said that the United States will take Mexico, but it will be like the man who swallows arsenic. It brings him down, and Mexico will poison us. And Mexico certainly does change things here as the war goes differently than anyone can imagine, as I should say wars generally do. No one can anticipate what the outcome will be. On the part of Mexico, they thought they actually had a number of advantages over the United States in this. One, Mexico, in order to get to Mexico, the Americans would have to cross some very difficult terrain. And in order to have an effective army in place, they were going to need to provision it. So they're going to have a very tenuous line of supply into Mexico. And also, Mexico anticipated the support from the British, as well as from the Native Americans and from black people in the United States who weren't at all happy with the situation of their own government. So someone in Mexico said that if you come with few, we will overwhelm you. If you come with many, you will overwhelm yourselves. So that's one anticipation, but things go a bit differently as General Zachary Taylor, who had been the general sent south of the Nueces, and who incidentally is a Whig, actually does very well in northern Mexico. So within a matter of weeks, the American army has had some big battles and has managed to get a huge chunk of territory, driven the Mexican army out, not only of Texas, but of much of northern Mexico. Now this worries President Polk because, Taylor is a Whig. And one thing Polk knows from history, even though he's not much of an historian, is every time we've had a big war, a successful general has wound up getting elected president. So this is really bad news if Taylor becomes a war hero in a war that Taylor's party says is a big mistake. And so Polk authorizes another movement by another general, Winfield Scott, to go by way of New Orleans to Veracruz, and then from Veracruz into Mexico to kind of create a diversionary thing. And what happens in this is Scott and the American army wind up capturing Mexico City. Okay? So here you have this war that is very unpopular in one part of the country, and particularly among one political party, the Whigs. And the two great generals of the war are both Whigs. And very quickly they wind up conquering most of Mexico. And now President Polk has sent a diplomat to negotiate a treaty with Mexico, sending him early in the war, saying, okay, if Mexico agrees to give us Texas, that'll be enough. But now, the United States has an army in Mexico City and has driven the Mexican army out of most of northern Mexico. Plus, another group in another part of the northern territories of Mexico, in what is now California, have declared the independence of California. And an American army has gone from the Indian Territory out to Santa Fe and then out to what's now San Francisco, and established, basically gotten the Mexicans out of or established new governments in this territory. So Polk says to his negotiator, no more of this, hey, give us Texas and we'll be happy. We want all of Mexico. What do you think of that? You're a little more excited about the war now, right? We've got all of Mexico. Well, they can stay there, right? I mean, the people of Louisiana stayed there. They don't have to go anywhere. They can stay there, and they're Americans now. You would say it's empire building, which is what John Quincy Adams and Albert Gallatin had been saying. And they've been raising this question, is this a republic or is it an empire? Are we trying to subjugate other people, or are we trying to allow them to govern themselves? And this is one of those moments. You have people like Adams and Gallatin who remembered the republic and now see it shifting into something else, an empire. So, some people think, well, why not? Other countries have empires, right? So why not? You don't see a reason why not. Okay. Anyone else see a reason why not? I mean, we took it. Should we give it back now? Say, here you go. General Scott actually tells the negotiator, Polk has sent this order. Okay, no, just Texas. We want all of Mexico. He says, no, just make a treaty by which Mexico cedes essentially everything north of the Rio Grande, and then California and what becomes New Mexico, so north of the Gila River and what's now southern Arizona. And even if you do make a treaty by which Mexico cedes all of Mexico, the Senate will never ratify it. So just make a treaty getting essentially a third of what now is Mexico and make Mexico pay the damages, and we'll be all set. So that's what happens. Polk is quite upset with this turn of events, but it does the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico cedes all of this territory stretching from, well, the Rio Grande north and from the Gila River and what's now southern Arizona north. This all becomes part of the United States. New territories added under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So what is now California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, become part of the United States, as well as Texas, of course, which is where the trouble started. So this is a great thing. All of this territory and great.
I know that California had a lot of people, but Colorado and all those?
They didn't have many people. In fact, the biggest settlements in the whole territory were this Texas settlement, but then along the upper Rio Grande in what's now New Mexico. And those are places that have been pretty well settled even before the Spanish arrived. And they had become, Spain had been trying to bolster that area since the 1600s. So that's a pretty well-established area along the upper Rio Grande. And this is going to cause a bit more trouble as a consequence because it is fairly thickly settled. There are some people in the area around San Francisco, and there will be more after 1849. This is still 1847, 48 when we're talking about. And another thing that happens actually in 1847 is a congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot though the Whigs have control of Congress now. And David Wilmot, who's a Democrat from Pennsylvania, proposes a rider to an appropriations bill saying that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude will exist in any of the territories the United States gets from Mexico. What do you think of this? Excuse me? What happened? Well, that's a good question. What does happen to Texas? Texas wanted to be annexed, but now if they're annexed, they're part of the United States. And are they gotten from Texas? That's a big question. Would you feel differently if we said Texas isn't part of this?
Oh, no, I was just wondering, the slaves.
Yeah, okay, there are a lot of slaves in Texas, but then there are all these other places where there aren't slaves. So will they not be able to have slaves is, I suppose, the question here.
Did he have slaves? Mexico abolished slavery.
Well, but will this mean people from slave states won't be able to go into these territories? They won't be able to bring their slaves with them. This awakens another question, or reawakens another question. Remember back in 1820, Congress had passed the Missouri Compromise, and they established the southern boundary of Missouri as the boundary of slavery. You couldn't have any more slavery north of that line. Well, suddenly, and at that time, most American territory was north of that line. In fact, there was very little south of that line. Now suddenly, there's a whole lot of that territory south of that line. So wouldn't you assume that everything south of the 3630 line now would be slave territory, including California, half of California, plus New Mexico, Arizona, of course Texas, right? So here what Congressman Wilmot is doing is saying, no, there won't be any slavery in that territory. Well, this means, and face it, the Southerners were the most gung-ho about the war in the first place. So now you're telling slave owners they can't go into this territory. That seems a little unfair. Should have told them that before the war started. That, yeah, we're going to get all this territory, but you're not going to be able to bring your slaves to it. You had your hand up a minute ago, I think. No? Okay. So Wilmot introduces this, and it passes the House of Representatives, never passes the Senate. It becomes one of these party line defining things as each side tries to get votes on Wilmot's proviso, and it becomes an issue back in the districts, how you'll vote on the Wilmot proviso, whether there should or should not be slavery in these territories. And this is one of the things that leads to a shifting of political lines, as here in the free states, if you support the Wilmot proviso, saying no slavery in this territory, you're more likely to get elected than if you say, well, why shouldn't there be slavery in this territory? In slave states, you're much more likely to get elected if you oppose the Wilmot proviso. And the group who has been most eager to seek a middle ground on this whole issue are the Whigs, and down south, Whigs who are running for office saying, okay, I can go along with barring slavery in this territory, are going to lose their elections. Whigs up here who say, well, they have a point about wanting to extend the Missouri Compromise line are also going to lose. Or people who oppose the Wilmot Proviso are more likely to lose than people who support it in the North, in the free states. So you see a shifting of political lines as the elected representatives from the free states come to be more defined as being from the free states. And they're not saying we want to keep slavery out of this territory because we think it's terrible what's happening to these poor slaves. They say we want to keep slaves out of these territories because slave labor drives out free labor. And if you establish slavery in California or in New Mexico, that means free laborers can't go there and become successful because they'll have to compete with slave labor, and slavery drives down the price of labor. So you have these shifting. In the North, more pro-Wilmot Proviso to keep slavery out of the territory. In the South, against the Wilmot Proviso because you want to allow slave owners to move out into these territories. So this is one of the consequences with this Wilmot Proviso, and there are lots of other consequences. I mean, should we draw the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean, do you think? Why not?
Well, I'm speaking as a, the time, well, it would depend. Ultimately, it would depend on how the states are being carved and things like that.
Sure.
Speaking to someone who
Yeah.
Anti-slavery, no.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah. So you don't want slavery in these territories. So you would support the Wilmot Proviso. Would anyone here, by the way, oppose the Wilmot Proviso? Just curious. I'm not going to then blast you for being pro-slavery. I'm just interested in, as an abstract issue. Yes, okay.
Well, we're saying back then.
Yeah, back then. You would oppose it. Okay, good. Anyone else? One brave soul here in New England, and after class we're all going to beat him up. Which, politics is a tough sport, tough thing. Okay, so then this whole issue of California, the Missouri Compromise line, drawn to the Pacific Ocean, so half of California will be able to have slavery and half won't. Reasonable, you think? You're saying no. Unfair to ask this particular group since, we're all here in Yankeedom, and you see what happened to this guy. He's just basically saying, well, back then I might have supported the Wilmot Proviso, and now we're all out to get him. Okay, so that's another issue. Another issue, well, what is the boundary of Texas? Texas now says, hey, the Rio Grande is our boundary, and this means it's our southern boundary and it's our western boundary too. So you remember that densely populated area we call New Mexico? Well, that's actually part of Texas. So Texas, it probably won't surprise any of you who know Texans. They claim just about everything once, they said, okay, we won the war. So Texas wants everything along the Rio Grande. So this is another of these big issues that comes up as a consequence of the Mexican War. What is the boundary of New Mexico? Another is, well, what exactly is the law on slavery in Texas? Can Texas be divided into lots of different states? Imagine, look how big it is. Will they all be slave states? New Mexico, what we call New Mexico, did not have slavery. Does this now mean we're going to introduce slavery into places where it had already been banned? And then there are a couple of issues that have absolutely nothing to do with Texas. One is, the fugitive slave law. The fact that the Supreme Court had said, yes, Margaret Morgan actually is still a slave, didn't stop other slaves who lived in Maryland from walking across the border into Pennsylvania. Nor did it stop people in Pennsylvania from protecting them, saying, you know what, we're not going to let slave catchers from Maryland come here and take people who they say are slaves. Similar things happen in other places that border on slave states. Or if you're a slave living in a place that borders on a free state, it doesn't take long to realize, hey, if you walk across the border, you're free. So Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, all slave states, all have a declining slave population because the slaves are leaving. And so congressmen from these states want a tougher fugitive slave law that will absolutely require people, magistrates, law enforcement people, to help in the recovery of fugitive slaves. No more of this, boy, if you can convince the magistrate not to help, they want a federal fugitive slave law, because after all, the Supreme Court said you could have one. Okay? So that's another issue. Another issue is this. Every foreign visitor who comes to the United States, it seems, writes a book about it. And their favorite thing to write about is how these Americans are always gassing on about liberty, land of liberty. Well, you go to the Capitol building on any day and you'll hear some congressman spouting off about liberty. And then you can go about 2 blocks to the largest slave market in North America and see people being bought and sold. So this becomes a staple of travel literature. And it's really kind of embarrassing. So there's actually a move afoot to prohibit the slave trade in the District of Columbia, because it's really an embarrassing thing. And so there's that issue. But then if Congress can prohibit the slave trade in the District of Columbia, isn't that another step to prohibiting slavery altogether? And if you're prohibiting something, it must mean it's bad. So why would you be talking about prohibiting something unless it were bad? And if you're a slave owner, you don't like to be told that what you're doing is bad. Imagine if you're doing something that we all think is bad. You probably don't like it. I know some of you might smoke, and we all think that's really bad. And do you like it when we tell you it's a bad thing?
No, not particularly.
Okay, see? So people have feelings. Even smokers, even slave owners have feelings, okay? And being... Another time I can explain how tobacco is what made the country great, okay? Come back for that one. So you have all of these different questions, and Henry Clay, who had orchestrated the Compromise of 1820, and then he had orchestrated the compromise over the tariff and nullification, sees an opportunity here to orchestrate another compromise, because he sees things are going really badly. The southern states have a convention in Nashville in 1850, and they say, we want slavery guaranteed in these territories we just got from Mexico, okay? Because they're all south of the 3630 line. They should have slavery. Congress should draw up a slave code to govern it. We want a stronger fugitive slave law. We want to protect slavery in the District of Columbia and stop calling us bad and morally degenerate and other things. And we want to say Congress cannot prohibit slavery in the District of Columbia. Okay, so let's draw the 3630 line to the Pacific, and let's protect fugitive slave property. Let's protect slavery in the territories. And if you don't do this, we might leave the Union. Okay, so it's not that there's this abstract feeling there. The southern states have a convention in Nashville, and they say, this is what we're going to do unless you let us bring slaves into the territories, protect fugitive slave property, and protect slavery in the District of Columbia. What do you make of this? Excuse me, you'd say let them leave. That's what Garrison would have said. Boy, good riddance. But then who's going to control all of this territory that you just got? I mean, who's going to control California? And this wouldn't it mean a civil war if they just leave? What's going to happen then? I don't know. So Clay, as a way of compromising this, proposes a big compromise measure. It's called an omnibus bill because it has everything in it. Okay? California will be one free state, what we now know of as California. Okay? We'll have a stronger fugitive slave law, okay, under which fugitives will be apprehended, will be taken back to where they're suspected of leaving from. We'll have a jury trial to determine whether or not they're really fugitives, and that will solve that. Okay? So here you have California, free state. That's something that people in the free states would like. Stronger fugitive slave law, that's something that people in the slave states would like. District of Columbia, ban the slave market, but we cannot abolish slavery in the District of Columbia unless or until Maryland abolishes slavery. You know, we abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, all the slaves in Maryland now, instead of going to Pennsylvania, they're going to go to Washington. Well, no. So you do something that People who are against slavery will like banning the slave trade. People who are for slavery will say, okay, we can keep slavery in the District of Columbia. As for the rest of these territories, the American law on slavery will prevail. By the way, what is the American law on slavery? Yeah, you're right. There really isn't one. We don't know. Okay, so that's a nice, vague, ambiguous thing. I suppose if you think the American law on slavery is absolutely, we have to have it, then you'll be happy. If you think it's, well, no, unless some legislative body creates it, that also helps. The federal government will pay Texas's war debt, okay? That's going to satisfy the people of Texas. But then, this is something else that happens. As I said, Texas claimed all of this as Texas, and Clay says, okay, we'll draw the boundary of Texas here to the Sabine River. Okay, so this actually means about 2/3 of the slaves in Texas now live in the New Mexican territory, where the American law on slavery prevails. And the American law on slavery, we haven't really decided what it is yet. This essentially means they're free. Okay, so Texas, happy you're paying our debt, but then you're freeing our slaves. So there really is something in this bill for everyone. And there's also something in this bill that's going to appall some people. Clay thinks this is a brilliant strategy because if you want California as a free state, you're going to have to go along with a fugitive slave law. If you want Texas's debt paid, you're going to have to go along with losing the slaves in Texas, and so on. What do you make of this as a legislative strategy? Everyone hates it, exactly. And so the whole thing gets shot down, and Clay, as he does every year, goes up to Newport for his annual retreat. And while he's up there, he is visited by not three spirits, but by a senator from Illinois, a Democrat, Stephen A. Douglas. And Douglas is one of the brilliant young men of the new generation. And Douglas proposes something different. How about, I'll take over this whole thing that you've made a mess of. And Clay says, fine, you'll go with my blessing. And what Douglas does is he takes each piece of this bill and he sees, okay, I can't possibly get people who want California as a free state to agree that, yeah, okay, a fugitive slave law. But I can put together a coalition in Congress that will support California as a free state. Okay? So I'll introduce a piece of legislation saying California enters the Union as a free state. Then I'll put together a piece of legislation that says stronger fugitive slave law. People who supported California aren't going to go along with that, but a lot of other people are. Plus, so he takes this whole omnibus apart and pushes it through separately. And on each piece, he puts together a somewhat different coalition who will support it. And what happens in this, it's a brilliant move, actually. The Whigs are the most interested in compromise. So in the interests of saving the Union, Whigs from the northern states will support a stronger fugitive slave law. 7th of March, 1850, there is Daniel Webster gives a speech explaining why he supports the fugitive slave law in order to save the Union. Okay? Whigs from the southern states will go along with California as a free state. And it's a great thing. They get it through. This compromise works. One by one, these pieces of legislation go through. So these various pieces of the compromise, except, of course, for this one, the border of Texas, it's drawn somewhat differently. Let's see. Yeah. Texas gets to keep a whole lot more of Texas. President Taylor actually says if the Texans try to claim the Rio Grande, he personally would lead the American army into New Mexico to fight off the Texans. He doesn't get a chance to do that, first because of the compromise, and second because he dies in July of 1850. Anyway, you have Douglas pushing this through. Southern Democrats will support the Fugitive Slave Bill, paying Texas's debt, the ban on emancipation in the District of Columbia, and they will be joined by Northern Whigs. Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs will support California as a free state, a ban on slavery in the remaining territories, a ban on the mass sale of slaves in the District of Columbia. They will be supported by Southern Whigs. And any of you who know anything about politics know that what you are going to do in the next election, if you happen to be in a slave state, and the congressman is a Whig who voted to allow California in as a free state, and to ban the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and to bar slavery in the territories, you've got three really big issues you can use against him. Also, if you're in a free state, and your congressman supported the fugitive slave law, paying Texas's debts, allowing slavery in Texas, and prohibiting emancipation in the District of Columbia, you've got some issues to use against that person. It makes it really exciting. Boy, I feel like going back to 1850 and running for office because, and so what happens after 1850, this compromise averts a crisis, and in the wake of it, the Whigs are pretty much killed off as a political party. In the South, Southern Democrats become the majority party, committed to the extension of slavery, and in the North it's ambiguous. And the North, remember, has more people at this point, and a number of different political factions emerge. There are some Democrats who are in favor of, California is a free state, not extending slavery into the territories. There also is a Liberty Party, a very small party that is against the extension of slavery. Most abolitionists, I should point out, don't believe in voting because this is being complicit in this system. It is a covenant with death, and if you vote, you're part of this. Okay? But the Liberty Party, a small group who think maybe we could vote. And then another group, actually, probably the most potent force that emerges in the North in the wake of the collapse of the Whigs is the American Party, which says, slavery isn't that big an issue. What we really need to worry about are all these Catholics coming into the country, these immigrants, and the Pope is going to take over. And they get this colorful name because one way they show of demonstrating their antipathy toward Catholicism is by burning churches. And often members of fire companies are also quite vehement in their Protestantism. When they come upon this crowd of guys holding torches, standing around a smoldering church, and they ask what happened, these guys all know nothing about it. So they're given the name Know-Nothings. Well, they like to call themselves the American Party because they're for Americans. And actually in 1854, the American Party sweeps all of the elective offices in Massachusetts. And the American Party, or the Know-Nothings, run Massachusetts for a couple of years. So you have the effect of the Compromise of 1850. We have these various pieces of legislation. Major effect is to kill off the Whig Party. Even Daniel Webster is turned out of office by the Massachusetts legislature after the 7th of March speech. So, the Compromise of 1850 meant to avert the cataclysm of civil war. It has some effect in, not causing an immediate bloodbath, but it has this other of further dividing the country. And let me just mention one more thing that happens. The hour is late. I could go on all night actually talking about the 1850s, and maybe I should and let you folks go home. Diane, if you could just leave the camera running, I'll just talk for a couple of more hours. We have, Stephen A. Douglas, his real goal here is to build a railroad from Chicago to the Pacific, particularly after gold's discovered in California. And the railroad, first there is a railroad running between Chicago. Chicago is a new city. It's beginning to take off. And Chicago to St. Louis. and then from St. Louis across Missouri, and then across what are called the Great Plains, what then was called the Nebraska Territory, and then across the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific. He wants to do this. There are a couple of big problems, the Rocky Mountains not being the least, but actually the more important problem is once you get west of Missouri, you're in an unorganized territory. There is no government there, and it's under the control, actually, of the Cheyenne, who don't want a railroad. In order to have a railroad, you need a government. In order to have a government, you need the Senate Committee on Territories to allow you to form a territorial government. And the Senate Committee on Territories will not do this because the chairman of the Senate Committee is a senator from Missouri named Davy Atchison, and Davy Atchison does not want the Nebraska Territory organized because under the Compromise of 1820, slavery is prohibited in the Nebraska Territory. And if you organize that territory, ultimately it is going to become a state. It will become a free state, and every slave in Missouri is going to walk across the border into Nebraska, and that's going to be the end of slavery in Missouri. Fugitive slave law or no fugitive slave law. So Atchison does not want the Nebraska Territory organized. If the Nebraska Territory is not organized, you cannot have a government that can protect a railroad running through Nebraska. You don't have a railroad running through Nebraska. You don't have a railroad from Chicago to California. Instead, you will have a railroad from New Orleans to California, across Texas. And Chicago will become yet another dusty ghost town, something that maybe could have amounted to something, but it'll be another Chillicothe, Ohio, or another place that flourished briefly for a moment and then was gone. Okay? So Stephen A. Douglas wants to build a railroad. In order to build the railroad, he needs to get Senator Atchison to allow a territorial government to be formed in the Nebraska Territory. Atchison will never do this as long as the Nebraska Territory has a bar on slavery. So in 1854, Senator Douglas proposes a bill in Congress that says, okay, we're going to divide the Nebraska Territory. The southern portion of it, roughly what is now the state of Kansas, heading west actually into what is now Colorado, will be the Kansas Territory. North of that will be the Nebraska Territory. So think about the Nebraska Territory as Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming. That's Nebraska. Kansas is a relatively small part of it. And that ban on slavery from 1820, we're not going to say anything about that in Nebraska, presuming it still stands. However, if the people in Kansas decide they want to introduce slavery into Kansas, they can do that. We're not going to bar it completely. If people in Kansas want slavery, they can have it. At first, when Douglas first sends this into the Senate printer, he leaves that part out, but then he revises it explicitly to say the 1820 prohibition on slavery in this territory is hereby revoked. So slavery will be permitted in Kansas. Okay? How will we know whether or not there will be slavery in Kansas? We'll have a vote. Douglas believes in popular sovereignty. This is a doctrine, well, it's actually a fairly profound doctrine, but another Democratic statesman, Lewis Cass, had proposed this. Let the people in the territory decide if they want this or not. No, if people in Kansas want slavery, they should be able to vote on it, right? So this is where we will leave things until next week, with Senator Douglas proposing ending the ban on slavery in the Kansas Territory so that if the people in Kansas want slavery, they can have it. If not, they don't have to have it. Either way, all Douglas wants is to build a railroad.